So this is class 229 of Golden Doves. We're on page 137. In its function as mental law, the object of the oral law is to give meaning to the tension between the script and articulation. So we've said before that the Sephardim, we refer to the Torah Shebe'al Peh as lei mental, la lei mental, the mental law. Really the mental law. So the mental law, it's almost like the mind is um um it processes the information in a certain way, right? So we process the Pesukim, we process the letters in a certain way. So as such, the oral law, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, is is there to generate meaning based upon the because there's a certain tension between the letters and how you articulate the letters. Again, the letters is the consonantal text, but then we articulate it, and that articulation sometimes creates a tension with the consonantal text, and as much as it kind of precludes certain meanings in the consonantal text, it forecloses almost certain meanings in the consonantal text. But then you have the Torah Shebe'al Peh, and the Torah Shebe'al Peh, through the Derashah, we generate new meanings which are other than the articulated text, right? So you have the articulated text, which is what we call the peshat. Let's just use that word as the conventional meaning, let's say. But then you have the Torah Shebe'al Peh. So the Torah Shebe'al Peh through the Derashah allows for that tension to be, I don't want to say resolved, but let's say it gives certain meaning to the tension, right? It doesn't ignore the tension. That's the point. So yeah, I'm going to read that sentence again. In its function as mental law, the object of the oral law is to give meaning to the tension between the script and the articulation, right? And now we're going to be reading a quote, and I don't recall where this quote is from. It's footnote 18. So give me a moment as I ascertain if this is still Blanchard or somebody else. So footnote 18, yes, The Absence of Book by Blanchard. All right, so here it is. Let us try to examine this surprising proposition by relating it to what might be a future experiment of writing. So if you remember in the last class, we ended with a quote from Blanchard, and here's so that we can understand what he's saying now. I'm going to go back to the quote from the last class. Yet the writing on the first tablets does not become readable until after they are broken, and because they are broken, after and because of the resumption of the oral decision, which brings us to the second writing, the one we know, rich in meaning, capable of issuing commandments, always equal to the law it transmits. So you have the first writing, which, because it's consonantal, is inaccessible. And then by trying to process a consonantal text, we kind of break the consonantal text. And in breaking consonantal text, we open the door for the oral law. And the oral law then conditions our mind, so to speak, and we read the new text, the second tablets, which is, of course, it's the first tablets, but right now the second tablets are accessible. And we understand the second tablets in view of the oral law, right? So let us try to examine now the new quote by Blanchard, or the continuation. Let us try to examine this surprising proposition by relating it to what might be a future experiment of writing. So I think the surprising proposition, well, I mean, it's surprising that the only way you can access the consonantal text is by breaking the consonantal text. That's the surprising proposition. So here's a future experiment of writing. There are two kinds of writing, one white, the other black. Mamash, like Divrei Chazal, right? One makes the invisibility of a colorless flame invisible. One makes the invisibility of a colorless flame invisible. The other is made accessible in the form of letters, characters, and articulations by the power of the black fire. Because the white fire, by this is from Chazal, there's a Midrash Hakuma, which brings the idea of the black fire and the white fire. I wonder if Blanche Shaw, I would have to say that he was aware of these things of Chazal, right? Because these are themes in the Midrashim of Chazal, so he must have known them, right? I don't know too much about Maurice Blanchot, other than he was French, but I would have to say, was he Jewish? I don't even know. I'm like, he could be. I didn't research the matter, but this is pretty surprising. So the white fire or the white writing means that the colorless flame is still invisible, because if you write white letters on a white parchment, the white letters are invisible. The other is made accessible in the form of letters, characters, and articulations by the power of the black fire. So the black fire on the white parchment is visible. And then you have letters, you have consonants, and then you can articulate, or the possibility of articulation. Between the two, there is orality, which, however, is not independent, but always involved within the second kind of writing. Interesting. So when you have the white fire on the white parchment, or the white letters on the white parchment, you can never quite read it. But then you have the oral mental law, let's call it. And then we learn certain things from Moshe Rabbeinu, right? And these certain things are from the text itself, of course. So that's the orality, that's the oral law, which leads us to the final black letters on the white parchment, which are the Sifrei Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote at the end of his life, on the very last day of his life, right? Which, however, is not independent, but always involved within the second kind of writing. So the oral law is relative to the second writing, or to the second law, right? So you start out with the consonants or the pesukim, but the only way to approach those pesukim is to read the pesukim. So we break the consonants by reading the pesukim, and that's Moshe Rabbeinu teaching the Torah to the Jewish people in Ohel Moed, where he would first teach them the pesukim, how to read the pesukim, and then that would be the foundation for teaching the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the explanation of the pesukim. Again, the articulation leads to the orality, let's call it, but the orality itself is the way we process the pesukim at this level. But then we have the writing, the second writing, let's call it, where Moshe Rabbeinu writes the Sefer Torah and gives each Shevet a copy of the Sefer Torah, right? So the Torah Shebe'al Peh is relative to the second and not to the first writing, because it is the black fire itself, the measured darkness that limits. Isn't that interesting? It's darkness. That's what the letters of the Sefer Torah are, dark. Because you stop. That's it, right? It's really fascinating. This is great. And this is really great. This is amazing. It's amazing how Judaism, Torah, is so rich with meaning. It's just unbelievable. Again, because it is black fire itself, the measured darkness that limits, right? Defines all light, makes all light visible. It's only by stopping, by choshech, kesam lachoshech, right? It's through the kes of the choshech that you can see the light. And only kara or elamitoch choshech, right? Thus, what we call oral is designation in a temporal present and a presence of space, but also at first development or mediation, as it is guaranteed by a discourse that explains welcomes and defines the neutrality of the initial inarticulation. Let's call that again. Let's read that again. Okay, here goes. Thus, what we call oral is designation in a temporal present. So what we call with the oral law. So the oral law, you're designating at this point in time the meaning of ot as a tefillin and a presence in space. So here and now, ot means tefillin, but also, and so it is because we are in olam hazeh, and olam hazeh is temporal. It's not forever. But while we're in olam hazeh, I'm explaining how what Maurice Blanchot is saying applies to the Torah. So there is the here and the now, olam hazeh, right? Again, because in olam haba we don't have the misvot, right? כיוון שנפטר העולם מהעולם נעשה חופשי מן המצוות שנאמר במתים החופשיים, something like that. The Gemara מסכת ברכות פרק ג', right? Right, but also at first, so what we call oral is designation, but also at first development. There was a development in the oral law or mediation. The oral law mediates between the consonants and the articulation as it is guaranteed by a discourse that explains. And part of the oral law is a discourse. That's why we have the Gemara, back and forth discussion. And the discussion explains, welcomes, and defines the neutrality of the initial inarticulation. It's precisely because of the neutrality, meaning an inarticulate versus neutral. It doesn't say this, doesn't say that. And that neutrality allows for, or the tension between that neutrality and the articulation through the vocalization of the text allows for derasha. Because the derasha is not always based on the vocalized text, as you, I hope by this point in time you know. The derashot can be based on the consonantal text, right? You see that many times in the Torah, in the Gemara, explaining the Torah, making derashot of the Torah. The oral Torah is therefore no less written, but is called oral in the sense that as discourse, it alone allows there to be communication, otherwise known as commentary. So what he's saying is that whether the oral Torah is actually physically written down or not physically written down is not the point. It's oral because oral, when you communicate with someone, you come to me, you want me to explain something to you. So we have a discussion. That's oral. Oral implies communication. So we're having I'm understanding your issue. Oh, now I see what you don't understand. I'll explain it to you. Then you'll come back and say, wait, but that doesn't make sense for this and this reason. So that's the idea of discourse. So the oral law is about discourse. It's about communication. Hence the Gemara, which is discourse. Otherwise known as commentary. And then what we're left with is the explanation of the Pesukim. That's why the Torah Shebe'al Peh becomes the explanation of the Torah Shebichtav. Speech that both teaches and declares, authorizes and justifies, because the Torah Shebe'al it teaches, let's see, Peri Aisadar is etrog, right? And it makes a declaration, and this is how you make the misvah of the Arba Minim, etrog, right? Authorizes, now you, through the authority of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, we have the ability to perform the misvah, and justifies, and we have also the explanation. Why is Peri Hadar etrog, Peri Hadar ba'ilan mishtana leshana? For example, there's a few other explanations, right? As though language, discourse, were necessary for writing let me read that again. As though language, discourse, were necessary for writing to give rise to common legibility. So for writing to be legible, you need discourse. That's great. And perhaps also to the law understood as prohibition and limit. So the language is necessary for the law to be understood as prohibition and limit. Because again, without commentary, without authority, without the black letters limiting, I'm sorry, the explanation of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the commentary, the discourse, you wouldn't know what the mitzvah is. The mitzvah could be this or that, or the isur could be what exactly is asur, right? Sha'atnez, what is sha'atnez, right? So not about the semen pishtim, what's semen, what's pishtim, when is it asur, how is it asur, right? So the so therefore the Torah Shebe'al Peh allows us to have the law as a prohibition and limitation. And the next section, wow, section 5, cosmology and the Torah. That sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to that.